Okay, well, I try to stay away from current politics, but there has been something that has just been boiling up so much that it's even made its way into my corner of the Twitter sphere, and it seems to be the only thing that people are talking about, since yesterday morning, it would seem. I've been noticing for close to 24 hours now that there's been a lot of tweets going on about, a renewed push that's saying that Trump is a racist and that there was something going on about Baltimore. And then I saw that We Are Baltimore was trending, and so apparently Trump said something mean about Baltimore. And then James Comey, that creepy FBI guy, who was trying to sell his tell-all book, which doesn't really tell much. Comey was out there saying, hey, if you voted for Trump, we get it. You weren't a racist. We're not saying you were a racist if you voted for Trump in 2016, but if you vote for Trump in 2020, well, then you're definitely a racist, because nobody can deny after today that Trump's a racist based on what he said about Baltimore. And so I thought, oh dear, did Trump say something about blacks in Baltimore? Did he perhaps use an unfortunate phrase that is a little outdated for our current political climate? Did he perhaps say that the blacks have ruined Baltimore, a once great city? What could Trump have possibly said that in and of itself means he is a virulent racist? And lo and behold, just a few minutes ago, I decided to go to his feed and scroll back to yesterday morning and see what exactly it was that he said about Baltimore that started off this whole controversy. And after reading it, it turns out that there is no controversy here. This is an absolute non-troversy, because all the president said, apparently, was that, Elijah Cummings, who he's not a big fan of, was, saying, I'll get into that in a minute, but he said something the president didn't like, and the president said, hey, Mr. Cummings, your district in Baltimore is full of trash, and it's, rat and rodent infested. Why don't you go focus on, dealing with your home before you start telling the rest of us how to live our lives? And to add some context to that, I went to look and see what Mr. Cummings had been saying that had enraged the president. And apparently, Elijah Cummings was, pressing on the Border Patrol for what he considered to be the poor conditions at the border and how people who were being detained were having to live. He thought apparently that they were living in disgusting conditions down at the border, the folks who were being detained for illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. And so Trump went out there and said, hey, why don't you look in your own backyard? He who lives in a glass house shall not throw stones. And, to be honest, that was a pretty good retort. So I failed to see on the surface where the racism comes in, because all he did was he looked at Cummings and said, hey, don't criticize us. Why don't you look at yourself? There's a bunch of trash floating around your district. And that's not wrong. I mean, Cummings' district in Baltimore, and Baltimore overall, is not a very nice place to live. The city's very run down. There's a lot of abandoned buildings, and there's a bunch of trash everywhere. It's, there's high crime. It's very dangerous. It's not the kind of place you would want to pick to raise your kids, certainly. So now that I've established why Baltimore was trending and why Trump was mad at Elijah Cummings, who is a congressman from Baltimore, of course, I still couldn't figure out where the racist part was. Why is everyone saying now that all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's so clear now that Trump is a racist? How can you not see it? If you vote for him after this, well then you're embracing his racism. This is the most racist man who has ever lived. And finally, after reading some left-wing tweets and seeing a bit of an excerpt from the Baltimore Sun, which I'll get into that in a minute, apparently people are taking issue with the fact that Trump used the phrase rat and rodent infested. Now, of course, he was referring to, the section of the city that is within Congressman Cummings' district and saying that's rat and rodent infested. And people take, apparently, rat and rodent to be some kind of a euphemism for black people. Perhaps I grew up in a sheltered life, but I've heard a lot of slurs for black people in my day. And I've never heard someone call black people rats. I've heard rats and rodents, used as sort of a euphemism for Jewish people. In the old Nazi propaganda, there's a lot of depictions of Jews as rats. You never really get that in the United States, at least that I've ever heard. Certainly not in modern America, but I've never in history anywhere in the world I've ever heard black people compared to rats. So I don't know how someone could take a statement of Trump saying that a place is rat and rodent infested and then take that to mean that he was talking about black people. It would seem to me that he was talking about rats and rodents. I could understand someone on the left trying to, dishonestly read something that Trump wrote about raccoons and say that he was talking about black people, because, people have called black people coons in the past, and of course a coon's an animal. So that at least would make sense, even if Trump clearly wasn't talking about black people, in some kind of a statement. But that's not even the case here. I've never heard of black people being compared to rats. And lo and behold, lots of Trump supporters and other people decided after people started calling Trump racist to post videos of rats in Baltimore. Because believe it or not, when you have a big city with a lot of rundown sections and a lot of abandoned buildings and a lot of trash floating around, you're going to have rats that move in. I mean, most densely populated cities in the world are rat infested to some extent. Of course, there's certainly a spectrum. There's a wide gulf between Singapore, for example, which is pristine and throws people in prison for chewing gum because they're afraid that somebody will spit their gum out on the sidewalk and dirty the place up. There's a wide gulf between a place like Singapore and New Delhi, which has rivers of trash. But Baltimore clearly is not is a long way from the Singaporean end of the spectrum and more towards the New Delhi end. But of course, it's nowhere near as dirty as New Delhi or many other cities around the world. But Baltimore certainly is comparable to a place like Detroit. And I don't think there's anyone who disputes that Detroit is very much a rundown and rat-infested city. I think the main difference between Detroit and Baltimore is that there's still a lot of people in Baltimore, so they still have a pretty high population density, whereas Detroit is run down and pretty much been abandoned by many of the people who originally lived there. So I don't expect this to be a controversy probably even by Monday, because this is so far-fetched and ridiculous, and the word racist has been stretched so thin and meant to mean very much just things that people don't like. It doesn't really mean racist anymore. I don't think anyone's really going to take this attack from the left seriously. At first, again, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I don't know why I still do, but I thought, oh, come on, if they're all being this adamant about it, Trump must have said something pretty bad. But nope, I mean, there's just nothing to this. So if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.